Welcome to Human. I am here with Brian Naranjo. He is a retired U.S. diplomat. Until about a year ago, he was Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. And prior to that, he was also the former Deputy Chief of Mission for the U.S. Embassy in Caracas. He has the distinction of having met Hugo Chavez years ago and also being expelled from Venezuela by the Maduro regime. Not your average cocktail chatter, but he lives in the DC area, is retired now, and we're going to focus on the relationship between the United States and Mexico as we move forward in the security situation when it comes to drug cartels and the designation of foreign terrorist organizations and what that means. So before we get started on that particular vein, Brian, I wanted to talk to you about something you said as we were prepping for this conversation. You had mentioned how Mexico is a country that a lot of major spies who have betrayed the United States have gone through. And you told me about who some of those people are. They have included former Defense Intelligence Agency senior official Ana Montes, who spied for Cuba, Kendall Myers, who was a State Department intel analyst who spied for Cuba, former CIA officer Aldrich Ames, who was a incredibly devastating spy for the Soviets who worked in counterintelligence at CIA. So why Mexico? And your turn.
Okay. Yeah, no, Sasha, thank you for the invitation to join you. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about some of the security challenges we face with Mexico that go beyond the very narrow discussion of the border or something like that. Look, Mexico is a major partner, obviously, a major neighbor of the United States. It's also a very permissive environment, okay? Mexico City is one of the few places in the world where you basically have all the bad guys operating. You've got the Russians there, the North Koreans, the Cubans, you have the Iranians, and you have others all operating there. And it is true, looking back over, quite frankly, nearly 100 years of kind of intelligence history, there are very few cases of espionage against the United States that have not had some sort of nexus to Mexico. Okay, that can include those cases that you just mentioned. Manuel Rocha, he was deputy political counselor in Mexico City some 30 years ago, for example. The
U.S.
office,
ambassador to Bolivia, who also spied for the Cubans, for those
correct.
who don't know.
And his old office was right next door to my old office in Mexico City. So kind of a small world kind of thing. But it's been considered, I think, by many of those operating against us to be a much more permissive environment. It is also a place that is very entwined with the United States. There are billions of dollars in trade going across that border every day. There are tens of millions of tourists coming from the United States every year. It is a place that is very easy to go to as an American that doesn't raise much suspicion. Sometimes when I was in Mexico, I used to joke that, every American had the constitutional right to go to Cancun on vacation, or to Cabo San Lucas or something. The American presence is really significant. Okay. And so it is an environment that is conducive for other services to want to operate in. Yeah.
Right. And you had described how for some of them, this was an intermediary location before they then traveled to Cuba to meet handlers. And
Yeah.
but okay, so since you brought up Manuel Rocha, what was your interaction with him? Were there any red flags?
No, none whatsoever. I mean, I met him as a very junior officer in Washington when he was getting ready to go out to Bolivia as ambassador. Um, Frankly, the interaction I had with him was unremarkable, quite frankly. I did find him to be shockingly arrogant. And this is in a foreign service corps that arrogance kind of runs amongst people at fairly high levels and whatnot. He was remarkably ambitious, but that didn't stick out in any sort of way. Colombian American, he had impeccable Spanish. By the time I met him, was towards the end of his career. He had decades of experience. Was considered to be a very seasoned diplomat. The one thing I do remember when I was serving overseas was watching him in Bolivia, and at one point making very public remarks that were extraordinarily anti Mesa, the president at the time in Bolivia. And it just, to me, as a Latin Americanist, seemed like such a boneheaded move because there's nothing that can help somebody more than being crosswise with the United States politically. And I was like, why would this expert have really taken on Mesa publicly and frontally and whatnot? Speculation has been that he was asked to do that because it would help Mesa's electoral prospects, and he indeed ended up winning a re-election and whatnot. But I had no real suspicions. I mean, this is another person in the merry-go-round of people that you meet in the Foreign Service, whether in the service or outside. He didn't come in with like a flashing light on his forehead that said, "I'm a spook" or anything like that.
They tend to not do that.
No, he was.
Uh,
It was also. I should mention this too. He was extraordinarily conservative politically. Presented himself as really a hard line, anti-Cuba, anti-communist, anti-left kind of point of view. So I know that he'd done that for much of his career and whatnot. And when it was revealed what he had been doing, I know that it really struck people to their core that this was what was going on. Yeah.
hmm. So let's move on to the conversation at hand, and let's go back to the days before Trump was back in the White House, before Claudia Sheinbaum began. What
Okay.
was the relationship like between the United States and Mexico when it came to intelligence and security?
Yeah. I mean, look, the United States and Mexico, incredibly complex relationship across all kinds of different fronts, trade, migration, economics, come to mind. But it's one of our largest, most complex embassies for a reason, and that there's always something going on in some obscure corner of that relationship. One of the important areas is our security cooperation. Okay. And it's been a cornerstone of our work with Mexico going back decades. That cooperation can be very difficult at times. Mexico has a very unique history. Its history with the United States is very entangled as well. Okay. But we have generally been able to work on security matters, particularly the sensitive kind, very closely. Mexico has generally had reasonably competent security forces when it comes to dealing with intelligence matters, terrorism matters, that kind of things. Um, the big challenge in Mexico has historically been finding trusted partners that we can share information with. Okay, finding trusted, willing partners can be a challenge at times. Um,
That's
we
because the infiltration of the cartels, the corruption. Why?
I would say all of that. Corruption has been an endemic problem in Mexico, going back, I mean, literally centuries. There are also intertwining interests that people have. Um, uh, you are always concerned about who else is accessing people in a place like Mexico, who else are they talking to. The United States has a special place in Mexico, just given the importance of the relationship to them, um, and whatnot. But I would say primarily for the corruption, much of which is fed by illegal activities, drug cartels, and things like that. I would also underscore, though, that they're not really drug cartels anymore. These are massive mafia-like organizations that are involved in all kinds of different business activities from their point of view. But we've had success in the past establishing vetted units that we could actually work with. One of the big challenges is, can you provide them actionable information to take action against somebody that they won't leak or otherwise compromise in some fashion? I think that generally we've had good success in going after special interest aliens who may be transiting through Mexico, maybe moving their money through Mexico, maybe engaging in business activities and whatnot. I think one thing that's really important from the Mexican point of view is they don't want to be fingered in the future as having been an access point to the United States, whether for intelligence or terrorist reasons or whatnot. And so they will bend over backward to make sure that they've done their utmost to try to act against those kind of challenges and threats. Okay. Their ability to do so is good, but their bandwidth and their capacity to take on more complex challenges can be quite limited. I would say. Yeah.
So some of the areas where the collaboration has been successful has been intelligence and counterterrorism. But before Scheinbaum was Obrador, and his decisions changed the dynamic. So can you explain to people
Yeah.
how
So
the relationship kind of took a beating?
yes, no, that's absolutely true. Lopez Obrador, his election really marked a watershed in Mexican domestic politics and the relationship with the United States. Okay, Lopez Obrador had been around for decades. He at one point had been a member of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI party, as it's called. But he tended to be from the left wing of that party. He has been trying to run for president of Mexico now for a good 20 years. He's considerably more populist, but he's also strikingly conservative. This is not the kind of populist that you might think of in Hugo Chavez, for example. But his victory really was a watershed in that it decimated the traditional parties in Mexico, the more conservative PAN party, I don't even know what PAN stands for right at the top of my head, and the PRI party.
I'm guessing
He
Khan was not bred in this instance, but go on.
no, no, it's a right of center party in Mexico, which the
That's
traditional.
Spanish, people. That I'm
Yep.
bringing out my high school Spanish for you right now. De
Yeah.
nada. Please continue. Yeah.
Yeah, PAN can mean bread, but not in this instance.
Yeah.
It's the National Action Party. Yeah, that's what it's called for in
Okay.
English. But
But let's get to
they
the point where he essentially did away with the previous security system and why he chose to do that.
So he comes to power. He's considerably more nationalist. He has much more of a social economic agenda. He's not necessarily on board with the neoliberal trade relationship. And at his core, he wants a relationship of peers with the United States, not client and host kind of relationship. And so he has embarked on a number of policies that really called into question the way we're doing business in the past. And I think one of the areas that really hit us hard was him shutting down mechanisms that we had to share information with trusted partners. Okay. So vetted organizations went by the boards. Okay. Now organizations, whether it's the DEA or it's ICE or it's the FBI or it's our intelligence services or the military, they don't want to share information the same way they wanted to previously because they don't know where that's going to go. All right, and they want to be able to share it with people who are actually going to take action on it. Okay, so that really put us behind the eight ball in terms of the kinds of things we could do with Mexico. Mexico would kind of come to us and say, "Well, we're your peer, we're your partner. You give us the information, we'll take action." Confidence levels on this side of the border are like, we're not handing you over, the A to Z on this cartel or that terrorist target or that intel target. So the conversations became much more complex. Okay, he also did away with mechanisms for managing the relationship. Okay, so the Medina Brownsfield memorandum that had been signed years and years ago by Janet Reno in the early 1990s, that was put on hold. Okay, and that outlined steps for informing the other government for activities that were going on, who's going to be informed, at what levels, in which circumstances, etc. So now there's no structure for doing that anymore. Okay, um, I think the other thing that was going on in parallel in Mexico was uh, AMLO, Lopez Obrador, did away with the federal police. Federal police was not perfect; it had all kinds of problems, but it was a body that the United States could interact with to advance investigations. Okay, when Lopez Obrador disbanded the federal police, um, the government lost hundreds, thousands of investigators, forensic specialists, technicians, etc. And they've not been able to rebuild that. I think one of the legacies of AMLO has been that we actually need to be rebuilding a partner that will have the capability that we want to partner with. Okay. the National Guard that he brought in to replace the federal police, up until so when I arrived there in 2021, only about 20% of this 80,000 person force, only about 20% of them were certified as police, able to go in and conduct investigations. So, what that meant, if you're a defense attorney and your client has been picked up for anything, really, all you had to do is challenge, did the officer have a certification as a police officer? If they didn't, now you don't have a chain of custody over evidence. You can argue that they weren't handled properly, detained properly, etc. That number has grown, but it was just a really fundamental thing that we don't necessarily think of on the day to day. That it is a country that does have a somewhat functioning legal system, and there are protections for defendants and whatnot. The other thing is, National Guard is not nearly large enough to deal with this number of security challenges nationwide, and so the federal government is really behind the eight ball in Mexico in terms of trying to partner with us on cartels and other bigger challenges down there.
Okay. And before we move into the more present moment, take us behind the scenes during the Biden years and what was being done on a diplomatic level as Obrador, or AMLO, as you refer to him and as his nickname goes,
Yeah,
is demolishing some of these critical ties between Washington and Mexico
yeah,
City. Um, like, what are you guys trying to do to preserve the relationship?
yeah. So I think the real keystone in the Biden policy was actually something they inherited from the first Trump administration. Okay, and that was something called the bicentennial framework. That bicentennial framework was agreed to in November of 2021, and what it tried to do is set up new mechanisms for managing security cooperation. Okay, and this was largely focused at drug trafficking, trafficking in humans, and other such activities, but think major organized crime, basically. And it had several pillars in it. One was a pillar, or three pillars actually, that was designed to manage foreign assistance that was being given to Mexico to try to build out capacity. Okay. Um, AMLO had taken an approach where he was micromanaging every single grant to the point of wanting to know who are the beneficiaries of this. Is this going to an opposition state? Because we were working at the federal, state, and local levels, or he didn't like the philosophical approach and whatnot. So he was using the ability to have his government sign off a memorandum of understanding to kind of regulate that. But this at least set up kind of expectations for the kinds of activities we would be doing. Okay. Another area was extraditions. Okay, we had a growing list of high-level cartel figures that we wanted to see extradited to the United States for cases and that kind of thing. And so we're trying to move forward on that. And then there was a component that dealt with investigations. Okay, it was more of a roadmap than anything else. But it served to guide the conversations that were going back and forth at the time. Okay, I think we were reasonably successful in getting elements of that whole framework done. Um, I am not. I've been away from Mexico for a year now. My understanding is that that framework is under scrutiny and may be replaced with a new framework here to be entered into between the Trump administration and the Sheinbaum administration. But it helped keep certain key activities alive. It helped keep some key pipelines of funding flowing. It kept some investigative work going. It was not as successful on the extradition piece.
Hmm. Okay. So, as these programs are ending and you're approaching your counterparts, what are they saying to you? Are they saying secretly, "Yeah, we know this sucks, but we don't have a choice. This is what we're being told to do," or
No, I mean, yes, there's an element of that. Okay, I mean, and I played the same role in my own past. Oh, gee, it's so hard, but you know how Washington is, and that kind of thing, as a diplomat. But um, there was a new reality that there was a new way of doing business in Mexico, and it is a much more fiercely nationalist approach. Okay, that demands an awful lot of respect for Mexico when you're engaging with them and whatnot. Okay, And so our interlocutors reflected that. I mean, the Mexican diplomats we're dealing with are just like the American diplomats. We have to reflect the administration in power and whatnot. So there was an abiding desire to have us hand off to them to continue carrying the ball. And we ran into that same kind of trust issue. I'm sorry, Sasha, I can't share that information with you because we are not confident that it's not going to go sideways or not going to be executed properly and that kind of thing. So we started rebuilding a lot of the kind of vetted units that we had previously. Okay. And that was a real key moment when we were able to kind of get some of those launched. It's very slow going to build those units. In a place like Mexico, you may have to vet several people for one position before you get someone who passes. There's training that's involved. The United States often pays supplemental income or supplemental salary for people to kind of dissuade or discourage, selling information or engaging in corruption and whatnot. I don't know the state of those activities, but they're nowhere near where they were, for example, in the Calderon administration some 10 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
I think with the arrival of Sheinbaum on the scene, she's much more of a pragmatist. I've met her numerous times personally myself. She had a security advisor when she was mayor of Mexico City, who really brought professionalism into the Mexico City police. He grew that force to a force of around 100,000. Not just the police force, but the whole kind of judicial security sector to about 100,000 people. He took a very intelligence approach to how he was attacking crime and things like that. He was able to drive down major indices of crime, whether it was murder, carjacking, and other things like that. Not perfect. Mexico City is still a rough city, although the murder rate is lower than New York, Washington, and D.C. Okay, New York, Washington, and Chicago. Excuse me. But it was a sea change. He is now the security minister down there, security secretary. So there is a bit of a return to pragmatism, but I don't think that today in Mexico you can really underestimate the influence of nationalism and pride in Mexico when it comes to executing policies. Yeah.
So that takes us to this very moment. And now that we're talking about Claudia Sheinbaum and we're also talking about President Trump in his second term, it's my understanding that she does want to up intel sharing. She wants there to be some kind of joint enforcement mechanism. Uh, what is the relationship like at this moment before I get into some of the more recent news events and how that plays into it? Just walk us through where the dynamic stands at the moment.
Yeah. Um, I guess I would have to start by saying, first off, Trump and Scheinbaum are very different characters than their predecessors. Okay. Of course, we know Trump and how he behaved from his first term in the United States. But his approach to Mexico in comparison to Biden is almost night and day. Okay. Very aggressive. We've seen the brinksmanship he engages in, very tough demands, not really trying to sugarcoat or to package things to be digestible for Mexican audience or leader. Okay, Scheinbaum is not the kind of populist leader, or excuse me, popular leader in the way AMLO was. AMLO was a very natural politician who loved contact. Scheinbaum is a very introspective person. Um, she lives in her brain. This is someone who has a PhD in physics. She was a member of the group in the UN that won the Nobel Prize for climate change. Um, Frankly, in some of my conversations with her, I was stunned by the detail she could get into. For example, where I only had one talking point on a cooperative energy project, all of a sudden she's talking to me about stuff, and it's like lost me within the first sentence. Okay, very detail oriented person, a very capable executive who delegates. Are you okay? Yeah.
Sorry, I
Oh,
have some construction guys here and they're trying
oh,
to get me to do stuff. And yeah,
okay.
go
My,
on.
my
Yeah.
my apologies. I thought I
Mhm.
messed up. um, um, she functions much more like an American executive would, confident in delegating to other people. Okay,
Yeah.
confident in letting them handle their portfolios, but then holding them rigorous to outcomes and things like that. That's
Yeah.
not an AMLO kind of style or whatnot. Okay. I think she's
Yeah.
also returning to an old style in governing there where the president is quite aloof and does not engage quite as widely with people. Okay. So I think what we're going to see here is she's navigating really rough waters with Trump right now. She has a nationalist component in her political bloc that really bridles at some of the things that President Trump says. Okay. And the impact of that, though, is it crowds out the space for her to cooperate where she may want to. I think it also means that where she can give us low hanging fruit that's not going to cost her much politically in Mexico, she'll be inclined to do so. So let's go back to those people we were seeking for extradition. Okay. They knew name, rank, and serial number of everybody we were looking for. Many of these people were held in prisons around Mexico. She very early on said, I'm cutting here. I'm going to send these people to the United States. They put an end run around the extradition process and simply expelled them to the United States. Okay. So I think some of her things that she's doing is designed simply to kind of get the United States off their back in ways that don't cost her in Mexico. Okay. I think she is interested in new ways to kind of go after the cartels, but she's going to want to have that kind of cooperative peer relationship that it doesn't appear that the Trump administration wants to enter into.
Right. And
Yeah.
I did have a question on this
Yeah.
exact point. The CIA has been gathering intelligence on the cartels for years, and they have a joint cell in Mexico City that is very active. Do they need the relationship with the Mexican intel services to be able to do what they want to do, which is go after these now designated foreign terrorist organizations?
Look, I mean, the I'm not a an Intel operator or anything like that, but it is always better to work with partners than try to work without them. Okay, particularly in an environment like Mexico. The vast majority of the information that we get that we can use comes from liaison relationships. Okay, it comes from things that are willingly shared with us. Okay, and it is important to have that exchange going on constantly, whether that's with our intel services, whether it's with our law enforcement components, whether it's with our diplomats. Okay, and I think there's enough interest in Mexico in maintaining that kind of exchange there because of the fraught nature of the relationship, the desire to keep important economic and trade ties with the United States going. It's important for them to show flexibility and access on other areas as well. Mm.
So, if this is an instance where there's still real advantage for the CIA, the DEA, the FBI to continue having a cooperative liaison relationship with Mexico's equivalent services, then how does the dynamic change when the US strikes a Venezuelan drug boat? What message does that send to Mexico?
Yeah, I really would have liked to have been a fly on the wall in the meeting that Sheinbaum had with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, when he arrived in Mexico. Rubio spoke very briefly to the press shortly after that boat was struck off the coast of Venezuela from the tarmac in Miami. Okay, I think that that.
And but this is it's important to note that his description was different than what the president said. They described it as having two different destinations, though Rubio altered his to then say that this was going to the United States. The New York Times reported just a few days ago that the boat was trying to turn around.
Turning around.
So there are a lot of details on this that are still quite unclear, with members of Congress also wanting more clarity on the matter and not receiving it as of right now.
Absolutely. No, it's very murky. I don't really know which way is up in all the details, to be quite honest. I've not seen presentation of evidence that the boat actually had drugs. It did make a lot of sense to me that there would be 11 people on board. If it's a drug boat, you're moving drugs, not people. Um,
So you're
there are a
saying it
lot of
did not
questions.
make sense? Yeah, yeah. That is
There are a
confusing.
lot of things that just did not add up to me, and the information that's been dripping out hasn't necessarily been clarifying things. But if we kind of put our shoes in the Mexican government's, put our feet in the Mexican government's shoes with Rubio flying inbound, it had to have been a big shock that the United States had struck this boat. It does not look like there were the usual rules of engagement were followed. Normally, in that kind of circumstance, there's an effort to try to intercept. There's an effort to try to warn that they may hail the boat, and it can escalate up to even having sharpshooters knock out the motors and things like that. I have no recollection ever of a boat being blown out of the water like that. Okay. So this raises in the Mexican mind real concern that regular rules of engagement are not being followed anymore, that there's a certain cavalier attitude towards international law and process and procedure and whatnot. And those are really important in Mexico because the recourse and reference to international law and basic standard operating procedures are critical in Mexico for managing this somewhat tenuous relationship with the United States over things like the use of force. We have to remember 1848, really important in Mexican history. That's when half of Mexico was cleaved off and became part of the United States. It's how my family became U.S. citizens. Okay. Um, there have been numerous incursions and use of force in Mexico over the past 150, 175 years. And this is very much up front and center in the mind of Mexicans. Okay. Mexican military still practices and plans for U.S. invasion. Okay. Army bases are largely arrayed across the northern part of Mexico. It seems crazy to us, but it's very much a core part of the kind of orientation of many military in Mexico. So it had to have sent shudders down the spine of someone like Sheinbaum, okay? Because she has been very firm in response to statements by Trump that he's prepared to launch missiles or deploy special forces to go after cartel targets in Mexico. And she's been very firm in saying, no, that is not going to happen here. And she's reverted to the we're a partner, we want to cooperate, we want to collaborate in going after these targets as partners and peers of the United States. Okay. So I have to think that she had to respond or say something about what happened in off the coast of Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know what that was, but it had to have been a hot seat moment for her because her maneuvering space at that point is quite limited with the Trump administration.
Right. I mean, I was also going to say there are also surveillance drones flying over Mexico to gather intelligence on the drug cartels. And Scheinbaum was quoted publicly as minimizing the fact that they existed and suggested that this was ongoing activity that just got amped up from the Biden administration.
Yeah, I mean, here again, she is trying to manage this for internal consumption. Okay, there's not a lot that Mexico could do if there were drones flying over Mexico. It's not a country that has the capability to do much about it, quite frankly. Okay, um, but it's another example where she's doing this delicate dance in her relationship with Trump and his administration. And it really is a relationship of presidents at this point, right? We have a very personalistic president in the United States. This is not someone who's moving the levers of the bureaucracy very effectively, okay? You have the Mexican system that really is a hyper presidential system. Now, she doesn't have the strong personality that AMLO did, but the very nature of the way the Mexican system is organized really makes her the sole person whose opinion really matters. She's the key decider down there. Okay, her party dominates Congress. They dominate the states. They have really annihilated opposition parties down there. Okay, but
So I guess the question for me is if she has this power right now, which is never a guarantee that you get to hold on to, but
sure.
you're seeing the rhetoric, you're seeing the actions of the United States, and you've just explained why the intelligence sharing is still important to the United States. We've seen the U.S. pause intelligence with the Ukrainians. Is that a measure that she would exact to try to stop the United States from getting a little too handsy in her country?
That's a really tough call for her, right? I mean, what are her priorities? Okay. Her priority is not really managing that relationship. She's managing those security related issues largely because we care so much about them. Her primary concern is addressing the socioeconomic set of challenges that Mexico has had for decades, centuries even. Okay. And so what she's trying to do is calm us down so she can get back to her core, homework. Okay. Um, I think she is concerned with going after the cartels because she realizes the deleterious impact they're having in certain corners of Mexico that are increasingly looking to be largely ungovernable. Okay. And supplanting government structures, whether that's in Tamaulipas or Guerrero or Michoacan or other places in Mexico. But it is a delicate balancing game. I think she would be very hard pressed to cut us off from that kind of information because she's already feeling inordinate pressure. Okay, this drone example, for example, I have to think that the going after the fast boat coming out of Venezuela was another thing that turned up heat on them. They're under enormous pressure to, for example, stop migrants from crossing in the United States. Another piece of low-hanging fruit that we had sought from Mexico for the entire time I was down there was to see larger deployments of the National Guard to Mexico's northern border, our southwest border. And they have done it. They did deploy large amounts of National Guard to the border there. So it is a constant calculus going on. Like, can I do this without paying an inordinate price domestically here in Mexico? I don't see that it has much to win, quite frankly, by cutting off in intelligence sharing, information sharing with the United States. It would have to be really an intense moment where she wants to trigger a nationalist response. And I just don't see that kind of moment right now.
Okay. I've previously reported on how the CIA's paramilitary, the Special Activities Division, was very busy. It was looking like there was a new presidential finding which would authorize the special forces to go after the cartels that
Yeah.
Trump designated as foreign terrorist organizations. The New York Times later reported that that was what happened. Trump signed the order. Sinaloa is one of the designated
Or terrorist,
foreign
yeah.
terrorist organizations. So, given those dynamics, what are we likely to see happen, and what would a joint effort look like if that is something that Scheinbaum would prefer, as opposed to the U.S. just doing it on its own?
I don't see Mexico doing anything like that anytime soon. Okay. Um, um, Mexico is loath to have U.S. forces coming into Mexico. Okay. The tempo and pace of training and other interactions that we have in Mexico is not commensurate with the kind of the size of the military that is there and whatnot. They micromanage these kinds of interactions and whatnot. I think that that is a political line that they're not prepared to cross in Mexico. Um, they do have very capable special forces units that have been able to carry out relatively sophisticated operations after the Sinaloa cartel or the Jalisco cartel, for example. And so they're going to try to hold a position that we need to be the ones taking action. Were the United States to take unilateral action, I think that that would put the bilateral relationship into a tailspin. Okay. And I don't think that we here in the United States fully appreciate the kind of emotional nationalist chord that that would strike. That is the kind of thing that could shut down all kinds of different cooperation. Okay. And not
Including
just
intelligence sharing?
absolutely. It could affect that. It could affect the tempo of other security cooperation that we do. It could affect what they're doing on migration. I don't think it would necessarily bleed into the trade and commerce relationship, but this would be an enormous hand grenade that you'd be rolling into the relationship. And where those fragments are going to go would be you wouldn't know until they actually hit their targets or whatnot. But I think the United States would pay very dearly across a very wide portion of the relationship. Yeah.
Hmm. And at the same time, these drug cartels have their own spy networks. Can you take us through the infiltration and who they use to keep
Yeah.
an eye on everybody and what they're doing?
We really need to stop calling them drug cartels, and I think really start referring to them as mafia-like organizations. They are massive organized crime organizations. Okay, um, and just give you an example, I had to go up to Tamaulipas in Mexico a number of times. That's in the far northeastern corner of Mexico. It abuts the Rio Grande, Brownsville, and Laredo, and whatnot. Um, there are 22 municipalities in Tamaulipas. None of them have police forces. Okay. Um, the criminal groups are involved in everything in society. It's not just about pushing drugs into the United States. It's also about managing the migrant flows, trafficking in people. But it's also, they're deeply embedded into government contracting. They're deeply embedded into the way people get permits to build houses or buildings and whatnot. You effectively go and get your permit from the cartel before you actually get the real permit from the government. Okay. They're setting the prices for cement. They're providing preferred providers for tomatoes that are going to be sold in bodegas and markets and whatnot. They operate with vast networks of informants and watchers, for example. Highways in that northeastern corner of Mexico are monitored 24/7 by what they call halcones or hawks. Okay. These can be very young people. They can be kids who are just paid to sit on a hilltop somewhere and watch for government vehicles, um, people coming from outside, etc. They are tough areas to get into. Now, you talk about corners of Sinaloa, for example. Um, it is nearly impossible for um, officials at the municipal, state, or federal level to get into those areas without being found out. Okay, they are paying an inordinate amount of money for secure communications networks. They are paying for encryption capabilities. They're very sophisticated. They're using drones now, not just for kind of offensive attacks and things like that, but for surveillance. Okay, and understanding giving them situational awareness for what's going on around them. Um, it is very, very sophisticated. And I think that really speaks to the need for, frankly, having a very sophisticated response to them. I think one of the more problematic things about using a finding to launch special forces into Mexico is that's not the right tool. All right, you can't go and hunt mosquitoes with a sledgehammer. Okay, you have to be able to try to dismantle these organizations as networks and whatnot, and you have to have that local partner that's capable of engaging across a much wider range of capabilities to do so effectively. Okay, so we could set aside the whole issue whether that is legally appropriate, whether that is correct or whatnot. I just don't see that it's going to work. Okay, in Mexico, but these cartels are very, very sophisticated. Um, they're involved in all kinds of different business streams these days, and to pay for that whole network of informants, of reconnaissance, etc., requires that they take in enormous sums of money every year. So that's another reason why they diversify. It's estimated that just off of migration alone, they're probably taking in 15 to $20 billion a year. You know, and that's small change compared to what they might be doing in fentanyl, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what Scheinbaum and her leadership decides to do with the U.S., without the U.S., will have major repercussions on the migration flow into the United States, drug flows into the United States, et cetera. You'd also mentioned fentanyl, and this is an area that also means that we need to talk about China. There was one drug cartel operative from China who escaped extradition to the United States. His name, and I'm probably messing this up, but this is what happens when you are a producer and everything all in one. But Zedong Zhang, he apparently escaped through a wall during house arrest, which the fact that he was under house arrest as opposed to imprisoned when he allegedly laundered $150 million for Mexican gangs and smuggled drugs, that's a whole other story. But here is a definitive example of how China exploits Mexico. And how is that playing into this conversation?
Um, Mexico's under a lot of pressure to really tighten up its relations with China when it comes to precursor chemicals, when it comes to technology and how it's used in Mexico. These surveillance systems that deploy cameras in different cities and across different states. The low bid contractor is generally Chinese, and whatnot. There's a lot of concern about the kind of information sovereignty in Mexico. I think that's one thing they're deeply concerned about, and increasingly understanding that they may not actually control the information that they're collecting, and it may be going to other purposes. Okay. As for
Can
the
you
precursor,
explain that a little bit more? I'm not sure I'm following what you mean.
um, oh,
Yeah.
that's the workers at your place.
Yep.
I heard the Spanish. Okay.
I'm not in Mexico right now, everybody, but yeah.
And I heard the Spanish. It had nothing to do with this conversation.
Right.
Um,
If it did, I would be a little creeped out by that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, in an effort to crack down on criminal activity in their municipalities, for example, a lot of towns and cities in Mexico have wanted to deploy camera networks. This is kind of made famous in London, for example, particularly in the city in London, where you're basically under video surveillance, 24/7. Okay. They've been very popular in Mexico. I'm not sure they've necessarily been effective because you need to know and then also have the capability to do something about it. Okay. But they've been very popular in terms of deploying these networks. The lowest price competitors tend to be Huawei and ZTE. Okay.
Those are
And so,
China-based tech companies who are sanctioned in the United States. They are
yes,
considered to be national security threats here in the
exactly.
US. Mhm.
Yeah. And so they'll come in with the servers, the networking capability, the cameras, and they'll deploy them in medium size up to very large cities in Mexico, like Monterrey, for example. Okay. Um, what are they doing with all that data? When um, somebody wants to access to that data in Mexico for investigative purposes or whatnot, can they get to it and whatnot? So there's big questions that are being raised there about um, what the intent of the companies that are selling this and the Chinese government behind it. Okay, that's a deep concern. And that's really all I can kind of get into at this point.
Uh-huh.
Um, we have been trying to educate in Mexico. The idea that you don't have sovereignty over your data is one that really weighs heavy on the Mexican mind. Um, I think that we are also trying to get better, get the Mexicans better focused on, for example, the precursor chemical piece. Who is sending what to whom in what quantities? Just very basic information like that. Um, Mexico is being more demanding in both regards these days. I think it is becoming somewhat tougher for the Chinese there, but it also may, particularly on the precursor chemical side, or frankly, I guess the tech side, may be a little bit like closing the barn door after the horse is out. Okay, fentanyl is very easy to make. Some of the recipes for it only require two chemicals. You can do this in your half bathroom. Okay, it's not like doing methamphetamines where you have relatively large production facilities that leave a trail in terms of chemicals and other signatures and things like that. It can also be broken up and done piecemeal and hidden very easily. All right. And you're talking about taking chemicals that cost pennies and turning them into a product that might be $20 to $30 per pill. All right. And you're going to pack it into a bag or a container of some sort that might be worth several $1,000,000 that you can tuck up underneath a flatbed truck, maybe weld it into a beam underneath that truck or something like that. And you're moving more in fentanyl that is easily hidden than a similar load of cocaine or marijuana would look like. I mean, if you were to do marijuana, you'd have an entire flatbed full of marijuana. Cocaine would be much more difficult to find. Um, since it's so easy to make and the profit margin is so wide, you have cartels that can lose multiple loads and still get multi-million-dollar loads into the United States. I just find that whole concept terrifying. These cartels, as sophisticated as they are increasingly hiring chemistry students who are still in college, or maybe they're still in grad school, to come to them to help develop the inputs that are necessary to make these drugs and whatnot. Um,
Right, but I
it's
mean, in the instance of this particular case, this was a Chinese man
yeah,
who is laundering money for Mexican gangs. I
yep,
mean, the relationships that have been formed between the countries and
oh yeah.
how both have advantaged themselves because of those unbelievable profit margins and the ease that you've just described.
Yeah. No, I don't know the ins and outs of that case. I know vaguely about the case and whatnot. It doesn't surprise me. The Mexican judicial system does leave much to be desired in the way that it investigates, prosecutes, and holds accountable people. Okay, it moves at a glacial pace. The judges are now elected down in Mexico. They're not necessarily appointed. And the capacity of the money laundering organization, the anti-money laundering entities in Mexico, and the prosecutors to go after them is very, very limited. Okay, that's part of the legacy that AMLO left Mexico in terms of when he decimated the whole judicial sector and security sector and whatnot. They are still rebuilding there, so it does not surprise me at all that a Chinese businessman or money launderer, or whatever you want to call the individual, was able to ensconce himself in the country, do business, and then flee. You know.
So, as the last question to you, Brian, we are talking on Monday, September 15th, 2025. Where are we going to be in a year? Will the Trump administration's solution to what looks like an escalating problem uh, end up making the problem worse, or will it have the effect of serving to at least start a dismantling process?
You know, after 32 years in the service, I feel like my known world has been shaken up like a snow globe. Okay, and just everything's flying around. I think if you'd asked me that question 1 or 2 years ago, I'd say we'd make progress. It's going to be gradual, but we'll start seeing institutions being built out. We'll see cooperation enhanced, et cetera. Okay. I'm not as optimistic right now. Okay. I think it is possible that the wrong kind of action by the United States could really put a chill on this kind of cooperation, security cooperation, intelligence cooperation, law enforcement cooperation, et cetera. Okay. Um, I think that there is desire on the part of Scheinbaum's government to want to make serious inroads in these regards. Okay, but they are operating from a very basic level. They've not been left with a good circumstance in terms of personnel, resources, capabilities, et cetera. And that all needs to be rebuilt, and that takes time. 1 year is not enough to stand up the kinds of apparatuses or structures that are going to be needed to make real inroads after these organizations that are essentially very sophisticated criminal networks. You know, and I think the other thing that would help turbocharge that would be real solid cooperation, but the kind of cooperation that is below the radar, that is quiet, and where the United States does not seek to take a victory lap. Okay,
Mhm.
um, the the quiet behind the scenes, no parade kind of approach to working with Mexico is one that's likely to have more success. I see the chances of that in the near term future here being relatively low. Yeah.
The
Sorry.
desire, yeah, yeah, I think the desire to show we are attacking this problem, sending a message to others. What you're saying is that that could ultimately be something that comes back to bite
Haunt us.
this, yeah, administration.
Um,
Yeah. Hmm.
we're engaging in a lot of performance activities right now that I think are designed to make us feel good, but it's kind of like cotton candy. You eat it, it's fun, you're at the fair, you get the sugar rush, and then you're left with not having made much of a dent in things at the end of the day. You could blow boats out of the water off the coast of Venezuela all day long at enormous expense. It's not the cheapest way to go after this, but unless you have partners you can work with in Colombia and Peru and Mexico, across Central America, wherever, you just can't make the inroads that you want to try and make against these organizations. Yeah.
Brian, thank you so much for coming on to share your expertise. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who is listening and who will listen. If you're enjoying these episodes, then please consider becoming a paid subscriber. This is all free because I want people to learn. I want people to have curiosity and compassion and learn more about these different facets of intelligence and security. Brian, really appreciated your time,
Pleasure.
and I'll look forward to continuing to talk.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been fun. Thank you very much, Sasha.
Don't sound so surprised. Of course it was fun.
No,
All right. Bye,
lots.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye.